You are standing at the meat counter, staring at 1 pound of ground beef, and it costs more than a whole family dinner used to cost for a week. You almost walk away. Don't, because what I am about to hand you turns that single pound into 6 full meals, and it comes straight from people who fed families of 8 on almost nothing. This is not a diet trick. This is survival knowledge, tested in the hungriest years this country ever lived through, and it never stopped working. I grew up hearing these methods at my grandmother's kitchen table in eastern Ohio, watching her stretch a nickel's worth of hamburger across a Sunday, and for years I laughed at it. Then prices climbed, my paycheck stayed flat, and I finally understood she had been right the whole time. Stay with me to the end, because there is one method buried in a United States Department of Agriculture bulletin from 1933 that let a mother feed her children beef every single day on less than $1 a week, and almost nobody alive remembers it. You do not need land. You do not need a freezer full of food. You need one skillet, a few pennies, and the willingness to hear what the old folks knew. Let me start with the thing that shocked me most when I went back and actually listened. When my grandmother made hamburger, she never once cooked a plain patty. Not ever. To her, a bare hamburger was a sign that somebody had money to waste, and in her house nobody did. Here is what she did instead, and here is why it mattered more than you think. In the winter of 1932, the average factory wage, for the men lucky enough to still have work, had fallen to around $17 a week. Millions had no wage at all. A pound of ground beef ran about 11 cents, and even 11 cents was a decision. So the women of that generation learned a rule that we have completely forgotten. Meat was not the meal. Meat was the flavor of the meal. She would take 1 pound of ground beef and mix in 2 cups of cooked oatmeal, a little grated onion, and salt. Not the fancy steel-cut oats people pay extra for now. Plain rolled oats, softened in water. That single pound of beef suddenly became almost 2 pounds of rich, savory meat that tasted beefier than beef alone, because the oats soaked up every bit of the fat and juice that normally drips into the pan and gets thrown away. I tried it myself last year, doubting the whole time. I made her meatloaf with 1 pound of beef and those oats, and I fed 4 grown adults with leftovers for the next day's sandwiches. 1 pound. That is the difference between spending $40 a week on meat and spending 15. And that was only the beginning of what she knew, because the oats were just one of the extenders. There were others, and some of them are almost lost now. The next one comes from a place most people never think about when they think of hard times. The dairy farm. You would think a farm family ate like kings. They did not. They sold the good food to survive and ate around the edges of it. And on those farms, especially across Wisconsin and Minnesota, the women had a trick that turned a scrap of beef into a dish that filled a table. They used stale bread, not fresh, stale. Bread that had gone hard and would otherwise be wasted. Here is the part that startled me. They did not just crumble dry bread into the meat like we do today when we make meatballs. They soaked it first in milk until it fell apart into a paste. That paste is called a panade, and it does something almost magical. It holds water inside the meat while it cooks, so a small amount of beef stays juicy and tender instead of shrinking into a hard little lump. 1 thick slice of stale bread, soaked in a 1/4 cup of milk, mixed into 1/2 pound of ground beef, would make enough meatballs to cover a plate of noodles for a whole family. They called the dish porcupine meatballs when they pushed raw rice into the center, because the grains poked out like little quills as they cooked. The rice swelled, the meat stretched even further, and a 1/2 pound of beef became dinner for 6. Think about what that means for you right now. You are throwing away the exact ingredient that made their meals possible. That heel of bread going stale on your counter is not garbage. It is the thing that stretches your meat. But bread and oats were for the days when there was at least a little meat to stretch. What did they do when there was almost none at all? That is where it gets serious. And that is where I found the recipes that truly disappeared. There is a dish my grandfather used to ask for by name, and for years I thought he made the name up. He called it hamburger gravy over toast. Some families called it poor man's stroganoff. Out west they called it slumgullion. Here is how small the meat portion actually was. A 1/4 pound of ground beef, that is it, for an entire family. You brown that 1/4 pound in a hot pan, breaking it into the smallest crumbles you can manage, because small pieces spread the flavor across every bite. Then you sprinkle in a couple tablespoons of flour, stir it into the fat, and slowly pour in milk or even just water until it thickens into a thick, savory gravy. Salt, pepper, and if you had it, a little onion. You pour that over toasted stale bread, or over boiled potatoes, or over a scoop of plain cornmeal mush. That 1/4 pound of beef turned into gravy fed 5 people. And the astonishing thing is that it tastes like comfort. It does not taste like poverty. My grandfather asked for it his whole life, long after he could afford steak, because to him it tasted like the day his mother kept the whole family fed when the money ran out. I have made it on nights when I did not feel like cooking, and it costs me maybe $1.50 for the entire pan. $1.50. Now here is where I have to stop and tell you something that changed how I look at all of this. Because I used to think these recipes survived by accident, passed quietly from grandmother to grandmother. That is only half the story, and the other half made me angry. These methods were not just folk wisdom. They were studied, documented, and printed by the United States government, and then they were allowed to vanish. Back in the 1920s and 30s, there was a woman named Louise Stanley. She was the first head of the Bureau of Home Economics at the Department of Agriculture, appointed in 1923. She led a team of researchers who did something remarkable. They figured out, down to the penny and the calorie, how to keep an American family alive and nourished on almost no money. They tested how much beef you truly needed for protein. They measured how far you could stretch it with oats, beans, potatoes, and grains without anyone getting sick or weak. They published it in free bulletins, mailed to any household that asked. During the worst of the Depression, these little pamphlets went out by the millions, teaching ordinary women how to feed children on relief rations and pennies. And then, when the good times came back, all of it got quietly shelved. The bulletins went out of print. The knowledge that had kept a nation alive was treated like an embarrassment, something to forget as fast as possible. Nobody profited from teaching you to eat well on $1 a week. There is a great deal of money to be made teaching you the opposite. So the knowledge did not disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because keeping you dependent was more profitable than making you capable. That is the part that should make your blood run a little hot. But it did not vanish completely, because families like mine held on to it. And now I am handing it to you. Let me give you one of the recipes those government researchers actually promoted, because it is a masterpiece of stretching, and you can make it tonight. They pushed a dish that became known as American chop suey, or in some kitchens just macaroni and beef. Here is the ratio that made it work. 1/2 pound of ground beef, 1 pound of dry macaroni, 1 large can of tomatoes, or a few fresh ones cooked down, an onion. That is the whole thing. You brown the beef, Add the onion, add the tomatoes, and cook it into a thick sauce. Then you fold in the cooked macaroni until everything is coated. The pasta triples the volume. The tomatoes carry the flavor into every noodle. Half a pound of beef becomes a pot that feeds 8 people and reheats even better the next day. The reason this works, and the reason the researchers loved it, is that the starch and the tomato together do the job that most people think only meat can do. They make the dish feel rich and filling in your stomach. You walk away satisfied, not hungry an hour later. Now I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now. You are thinking this is fine for somebody with a real kitchen, a pantry, time to cook, maybe a little garden out back. You are thinking this does not apply to you, because you are in a small apartment on a fixed check with almost nothing in the cupboard and no room to store a stockpile. Stop. This next part is built for exactly your situation, so do not go anywhere. Because the truth is, these methods were not created by people with pantries and gardens. They were created by people who had less than you have right now. City families in tenements, widows in single rooms, people cooking on a single hot plate with one pot. Here is what you can do this week. With no car, no garden, and less than $5. Buy 1 pound of the cheapest ground beef you can find. Buy 1 large bag of rice or 1 box of oats, whichever is cheaper where you are. Buy 1 onion and 1 can of tomatoes. That is your whole shopping trip. Day 1, you make the hamburger gravy over bread with a 1/4 pound. Day 2, you make porcupine meatballs with rice using another 1/4 pound. Day 3, you make the macaroni and beef. Or if you have no pasta, a beef and rice skillet with the third 1/4 pound. Day 4, you take the last 1/4 pound, mix it with oats, and make small patties fried in their own fat. 1 pound of beef, 4 dinners, and you have not touched the rice and oats you still have left, which will carry you further still. You do not need to be prepared. You do not need to be wealthy. You need 1 pound of beef and the knowledge that the women of 1932 are handing you right now through me. And I want you to notice something about how you feel doing this. You are not just saving money. You are taking back control. Every one of these meals is a meal that does not depend on a delivery app, a fast food window, or a rising price you cannot fight. That independence is the real inheritance here, and if you want all of it in one place, there is something I need to tell you about before we go any further. I put everything I have gathered, the recipes, the ratios, the research, the methods that the government bulletins taught, and then buried into a book called Depression Proof. It is called that because that is exactly what this knowledge does to you. It covers the stretching techniques, the preservation tricks, the week-by-week meal plans built on 1 pound of beef, and the mindset that the Depression Kitchen ran on. If today opened something up for you, Depression Proof is where you go to finish the job. You can find the link in the description below, and you can have it in your hands before your next trip to the meat counter. Now let me take you somewhere darker, because not every family even had that 1/4 pound of beef to work with. In the hardest hollows of Appalachia and in the drought-stricken plains during the Dust Bowl years around 1934 and 1935, meat sometimes disappeared entirely for weeks. And here is where the old cooks did something that sounds impossible. They made beef flavor without much beef at all. They saved every scrap of fat. When they were lucky enough to cook a bit of ground beef, they never poured the grease down the drain. They poured it into a tin cup and let it harden. That beef drippings, that saved fat, became a treasure. A spoonful of it in a pot of beans, or smeared on bread, or stirred into cornmeal mush, carried the taste of meat into a meal that had no meat in it at all. My grandmother kept a can of drippings on the back of her stove until the day she died. I used to think it was disgusting. Now I keep one too, because a tablespoon of beef fat turns a pot of plain beans into something that tastes like it was cooked with a roast, and it costs you nothing because you already paid for it when you bought the meat and were about to throw it away. This is the mindset that we lost. Nothing was waste. The water you boiled potatoes in became the base for gravy. The fat became flavor. The stale bread became the body of the meal. Every single thing that entered that kitchen left as food. And that mindset is the thing that separated the families who made it from the families who went hungry. It was not how much they had, it was how little they let escape. But there is one more layer to this, and it is the layer that took me the longest to understand. Because stretching meat is one thing. Keeping it in an age before most people had a refrigerator was another problem entirely, and the way they solved it is almost completely forgotten. Think about it. In 1930, most rural American homes still had no electric refrigerator, an ice box, maybe, if you could afford the ice. So when a family did manage to get a larger amount of ground beef from a hunt or a shared cow or a rare good week, they could not just store it. It would spoil in a day or two in the summer heat. So they cooked it into forms that lasted. One of the oldest tricks came from the German and Pennsylvania Dutch families, and it is called scrapple, though the ground beef version was a poor man's variation. They would cook the meat down with cornmeal and broth into a thick loaf, then let it cool until it set solid. Sliced and fried, it would keep for many days in a cool cellar, and one small batch made breakfast for a week. The cornmeal did the stretching, the cooking preserved it, and the frying at the end made it taste rich and crisp. Another method was the potted meat approach. They would cook the ground beef until it was completely done, pack it tightly into a crock, and then pour that saved hot fat over the top until the meat was sealed under a layer of solid grease. That fat seal kept the air out. Air is what spoils meat. Sealed under fat in a cool spot, that cooked beef would keep for a week or two, ready to be scooped out and warmed whenever it was needed. It is the same principle the French turned into an expensive delicacy, but the Depression cook did it out of pure necessity with a quarter's worth of hamburger. I want you to sit with how clever that is. Without a machine, without electricity, without a single dollar spent on preservation, they made meat last. They understood their food at a level most of us never will, because we outsourced all of it to the freezer in the store. And here is the tension that has been building this whole time, the thing I promised you at the start. Because everything I have told you so far, the oats, the bread, the gravy, the drippings, the potting, all of it is powerful. But none of it is the single method that stopped me cold when I finally read it in that 1933 bulletin. Let me tell you how I found it. I had been collecting my grandmother's recipes, and I kept running into references to something the old cooks called meat that goes further than money. It sounded like nonsense, a saying I figured. But I kept digging through the Federal Writers Project interviews, the ones the government collected between 1936 and 1940, where they sat ordinary Americans down and recorded how they actually lived through the Depression in their own words. And in those interviews, again and again, women described the same technique. It was not the oats. It was not the bread. It was something they did to the beef before they ever cooked it, and it doubled how far it went while making it taste like more, not less. Here it is, and I promise you have never heard this. They took 1 pound of ground beef, and they mixed it, raw, with an equal amount of cooked mashed potato or cooked rice, plus 1 raw egg and a little water, and they let it sit for 1 hour before cooking. Not a small amount of filler, an equal amount, 1 to 1. Now everyone knows you can add filler, but here is the part that the bulletin from 1933 explained and that the modern world forgot. The resting hour matters. During that hour, the starch from the potato or rice absorbs the raw meat's juices and its salt, and the egg binds it all into a single unified mass. When you cook it, it does not fall apart into obvious meat and obvious filler the way it does if you cook it right away. It cooks into one thing, one texture. It tastes, from the first bite to the last, like pure seasoned beef, because every particle of that potato has been soaked in beef. A woman in one of those interviews, recorded in the mountains of North Carolina, described feeding her 7 children on 1 pound of beef, stretched this way every day for the cost of pennies. 1 pound, 7 children, every day. Because with the equal part potato and the resting hour, that 1 pound cooked up like 2 full pounds of rich meat, and the potato she grew herself cost nothing. I made it. I was sure it would taste like a sad potato patty. It did not. It tasted like the best meatloaf I have ever eaten, moist and beefy all the way through, and I could not tell where the beef ended and the potato began. My wife did not believe me when I told her it was half potato. That is the method that disappeared. Not because it failed, because a family that can turn 1 pound of beef into the equivalent of 2 every single day for pennies is a family that cannot be squeezed. And there is no profit in a family that cannot be squeezed. That single technique, the equal parts starch, the binding egg, and the patient resting hour, is the thing I most want you to carry away from everything I have said today. It is the closest thing to magic the Depression Kitchen ever produced, and it was written down by the United States government in a free pamphlet 90 years ago, and then buried. You can do it this weekend. 1 pound of beef, 1 pound of mashed potato or cooked rice, 1 egg, a little salt, rested for 1 hour. Shape it into a loaf, or patties, or crumble it into your gravy. However you cook it, you have just doubled your meat for the cost of a potato. And once you know it, you cannot unknow it. Every time you walk past that meat counter and see the price, you will remember that you hold the exact knowledge that made that price powerless over a whole generation. Let me pull all of this together for you, because I want you to leave with it burned into your memory, ready to use. Meat is the flavor, not the meal. That is the first law, and everything else grows from it. You never cook a bear patty when you can stretch it into a feast. Rolled oats, softened, turn 1 pound into nearly 2, and make it taste beefier by catching the fat. Stale bread soaked in milk keeps a small amount of meat juicy and multiplies your meatballs. Raw rice pushed into the meat swells and stretches it while it cooks. A 1/4 pound browned into a flour and milk gravy poured over toast or potatoes feeds 5. Macaroni and tomatoes turn 1/2 pound into a pot for 8. Saved beef drippings carry meat flavor into meatless meals for free. Cornmeal cooked into the beef makes a loaf that keeps for a week without a refrigerator. And meat packed under a seal of its own hardened fat lasts for many days in a cool corner. And above all of it, the buried secret. Equal parts beef and cooked potato or rice, 1 egg rested a full hour before cooking, so that 1 pound eats like 2, every day, forever. For the price of a potato you could grow in a bucket on a windowsill. None of this requires money you do not have. None of it requires land, or a freezer, or a special store. It requires 1 pound of beef and the willingness to do what your great-grandmother did without complaint, because she had no choice, and she made it taste like love anyway. I ignored all of it for most of my life. I thought I was too modern, too busy, too comfortable to need what a poor woman in 1932 knew. I was wrong, and it cost me thousands of dollars and years of dependence on a system that was happy to take my money. The day I finally cooked her way, I stopped feeling helpless at the store. That feeling is what I am really handing you, not just recipes. The end of that helpless feeling. Something was taken from us, quietly, while we were told to trust that prices would always be fine and the good times would always last. What was taken was the simple ability to feed ourselves well when they are not. Today you took a piece of it back. You are the kind of person who suspects that the most valuable knowledge is the kind nobody is trying to sell you, and today proved you right. This knowledge was set aside because capable people are inconvenient to those who profit from helpless ones. You just made yourself a little harder to squeeze. So tell me this in the comments, and I read them. Which one are you going to make first? The quarter-pound gravy over toast, or the equal part potato loaf that eats like 2 pounds of meat? And if your own mother or grandmother had a stretching trick that I did not mention today, write it down for the rest of us, because that is exactly how this knowledge stays alive. Do not keep it to yourself. Put it in the comments so someone else can feed their family with it. If you felt something click today, if you felt that old knowledge coming back home to you, then join the rest of us who are quietly recovering what was nearly lost. Subscribe and stand with the people rebuilding this the hard way, the real way. Because next time, I am going to show you the forgotten way Depression families made a single chicken feed a household for an entire week, right down to the trick they used with the bones that most people today pour straight down the drain. You do not want to miss what they did with those bones. I will see you there. I grew up on these recipes, and I keep going inside the hard time circle. This video gave you the overview, but in there I show you where this left off, every recipe, step by step. You can ask me your own question. And a real person, me, answers you myself. Thousands of thrifty folks like you are already right there beside you. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen. Cancel any time. No risk.